Hi, this is Dr. Claire, and this is our lecture on the excretory system. So the excretory system has two major functions. It eliminates metabolic wastes, and it maintains the balance of water and salts in the body. So it maintains homeostasis of osmolarity in the body. So let's start by talking about those metabolic wastes. So we, as animals, are chemoheterotrophs. That means that we get our carbon-based molecules from eating other things, and then we break down those molecules to make energy. When you break down carbohydrates or fats only contain carbon atoms, oxygen atoms, and hydrogen atoms. That's it. And so when you break them down, the byproduct of breaking those compounds down is carbon dioxide, which we can breathe out, and water, which is really easy to get rid of if you have too much of it. So those metabolic wastes really aren't that dangerous. But some other compounds in our bodies, proteins and nucleic acids, contain nitrogen. So when you break down those compounds, you're left with molecules that contain nitrogen. And those nitrogenous wastes, or wastes that contain nitrogen, are harder to deal with, and that's what our excretory system is largely dealing with, is those nitrogenous wastes. So there's a bunch of there's 3 different types of nitrogenous wastes that animals use. The most simple one is ammonia. And ammonia is simply a nitrogen atom bonded to 3 hydrogen atoms. It is what's produced when you break down a protein. You do produce ammonia when you break down a protein. And so that's a pretty simple molecule. It is, however, quite toxic to cells. So it can be a little bit problematic. Now, if you're in an aquatic environment and you've got ammonia that you've produced, you can actually put that into your bloodstream and diffuse it out of your gills or through your skin, and get rid of it pretty easily into the aquatic environment that you live in. So it's eliminated quickly and directly if you are a fish, for example. So fishes, their major nitrogenous waste is that ammonia. If you're a terrestrial animal, you cannot diffuse ammonia out of your body through your lungs because it needs to be in solution, right? So you have to do something with that because it's toxic. And so if it were to build up in your body, if you were going to concentrate it in an organ and try and eliminate it, it would be toxic to that organ. So you have to change it into something else. And so terrestrial vertebrates have 2 other types of nitrogenous waste that they convert the ammonia into. Mammals and amphibians use urea. So urea contains 2 nitrogen atoms, and it takes a little bit of energy to make because it's a more complex molecule than ammonia is, but it's not toxic. And it is water soluble. So urea, you can concentrate it in the kidney and pee it out, no problem. So you can get rid of your nitrogen that way. The problem with peeing it out, though, is that when you are peeing it out, you lose a fair amount of water with that pee. So some animals have an additional adaptation that allows them to conserve more water, and so they take an extra step. They convert the ammonia into uric acid. Now, uric acid is a larger molecule. It has 4 nitrogen atoms in it, so it's a very efficient way of getting rid of nitrogen. It is not water soluble, so once it's formed, it forms little crystals, basically. And so you can make a paste out of it, basically, and more or less poop it out. Birds and reptiles use uric acid to get rid of their nitrogenous waste. So if you've ever been pooped on by a bird, and who hasn't been pooped on by a bird, you may have noticed that there is a little brown squiggle and a bunch of white stuff, right? So birds, they pee and poop at the same time. So the little brown squiggle, that's the poop that's coming from the digestive system. And all that white stuff, that's basically bird pee. But it's the uric acid crystals that give it that white coloration. So that's what's going on with bird poop. All right. The problem with uric acid is that because it's an even larger molecule and more complex, it does take more energy to make. So it's more water efficient, but it takes more energy to build that large complex molecule. So there's trade-offs in each of these different types of nitrogenous waste. All right, so let's move on to the other important function of the excretory system, which is regulating osmolarity in the body and the osmotic balance. So you maintain the water in your body at a certain osmolarity, a certain concentration of dissolved stuff. And generally your body is maintaining homeostasis of that within the extracellular water component. So you've got water that's inside your cells and water that's outside your cells. And it's largely the water outside your cells that your body is concerned with, because if you have too much salt or too little salt in the extracellular fluid, then water will move in and out of the cells according to osmosis, and it can cause the cells either to shrivel or to pop, and that's obviously very bad. So you want to maintain a happy homeostasis of the dissolved stuff in that extracellular water. So let's talk a little bit more about what we mean when we're talking about osmolarity. Osmolarity is simply a way of talking about all of the things that might be dissolved in a liquid at the same time. So basically you could have salts, you could have sugars, you could have oxygen, carbon dioxide, various proteins, hormones, a whole bunch of stuff that's dissolved in the liquid that makes up the fluid in your body, right? And so osmolarity is simply the number of moles of solutes in a liter of solvent. In this case, the solvent is water. So the solutes can be any of those things I just mentioned, and moles is roughly 10 to the 23rd. That's how many molecules are in a mole. So it's just a way of measuring, of lumping all the different molecules that might be dissolved in your body into one measurement. Okay. And so what your body is actually maintaining is the overall osmolarity of your extracellular fluid. Okay? All right. So when your body is regulating this, it's trying to maintain that optimal osmolarity so that your cells are happy. And it's trying to do that by eliminating things that you don't really need in your body and maintaining things that you might need that are important. So a lot of times you're going to be eliminating excess salts, but you don't want to do things like pee out sugars, because sugars can provide energy to your cells. If you're peeing them out, that's a waste of that energy. So you want to maintain things that are beneficial and excrete things that are unnecessary. And so that's what your excretory system is doing while maintaining homeostasis. All right, so let's talk about how animals actually do this. So they have a number of different, they have very similar excretory functions, but animals are dealing with very different problems. If you're an aquatic animal like this pufferfish here, you have to deal with the osmolarity of your environment as well as your own osmolarity, and that can really affect how you deal with the concentrations of stuff in your system. Terrestrial animals, on the other hand, they have to be worried about where their next water source is going to come from, and so they have to conserve and not dehydrate. So terrestrial animals tend to be much more concerned about conserving water within their system than aquatic animals. All right, so let's take a look at some of these animals in particular. If you're looking at aquatic animals, there's two ways to deal with the osmolarity of your environment if you're an aquatic animal. You can be an osmoconformer, and that's where you have the same osmolarity in your body as is in the surrounding environment. Or you can be an osmoregulator, where you maintain a different level of osmolarity in your body than in the surrounding environment. It's kind of analogous to being an ectotherm or an endotherm, where the ectotherm's temperature is the same as the environment, and the endotherm's temperature is maintained at a constant rate that's usually different from the environment. Here, the osmolarity is either the same as the environment if you're an osmoconformer, or it's being regulated at a particular level if you're an osmoregulator. So an example of osmoconformer is a sea cucumber. The concentration of stuff in their body fluids is exactly the same as the concentration of seawater. And they actually can't really control the movement of water in and out of their bodies. It just kind of goes by osmosis. Remember, osmosis is the diffusion of water down a concentration gradient across the cell membrane. So osmosis is happening all the time in every animal. But an osmoconformer, they have the same amount of dissolved stuff inside their body as in the seawater. And so what that means is that there's an equilibrium of water moving in and moving out of the animal. And so they don't have to worry about that. Now, they have the same amount of dissolved stuff, but they may not have the same stuff that's dissolved. So inside a sea cucumber, you might find a higher concentration of, say, sugar than you would find in seawater. And seawater might have a higher concentration of salt than you would find inside a sea cucumber, but the total amount of dissolved stuff is equal inside and outside of the osmoconformer. Osmoregulators, on the other hand, they maintain their internal fluids at a different osmolarity than the seawater. So let's take a look at some osmoconformers. So here's a marine fish. Marine fish has to deal with a very, very salty environment. So the osmolarity of the surrounding environment is very high. The marine fish's body has a much lower osmolarity. So what that means is that there's less dissolved stuff inside the fish. Less dissolved stuff means that there's more water. So if there's more water, there's a higher water concentration inside the fish than outside the fish. And so through osmosis, water would move down its concentration gradient. So it moves from the inside of the fish to the outside of the fish. So marine fish are constantly at risk of becoming dehydrated and having not too high of an osmolarity of their internal tissues. So how do they deal with that? Well, there's a couple things they can do. They can lower the salt levels of their tissue. They do this by drinking seawater and then actively transporting salt over their gills, and also actively pooping out the salt. And so that gets the salt out of their system and maintains their osmolarity at a lower level. Okay? So that's what marine fish do. But if you're a freshwater fish, you've got the opposite problem. You're in a water with very low osmolarity, way less than is in your body. And so if there's less stuff dissolved in the surrounding water than there is in your body, less stuff dissolved means more water. So if there's a higher water concentration outside the body than inside the body, osmosis is going to cause the water to move into the fish. All right? So they are constantly trying to deal with too much water in their system. And they deal with this by actively transporting salts in through the gills rather than actively transporting it out. And also by peeing a lot. So freshwater fish are just constantly producing dilute urine and trying to get rid of all the water that is coming in. So they're constantly peeing. Okay? So that's what's happening with fish. Let's take a look at some terrestrial animals. Again, terrestrial animals have different problems than aquatic animals. They're not in an aquatic environment. So they have other problems that they have to deal with. If you're a seabird, like a albatross, this is actually a petrel, which is a relative of an albatross, but most people have heard of an albatross and most people haven't heard of a petrel, whatever. They're closely related. If you're an albatross, you spend all your time out on the ocean. The only place you get water is from drinking seawater. I don't know if you guys have ever been told, humans cannot drink seawater. The osmolarity of seawater is higher than the osmolarity that our kidneys can produce. Our kidneys cannot produce something that is as concentrated as seawater. So when you drink seawater, in order to get rid of the salt that you've just drunk in, your body has to pee out more water than you've taken in from drinking the seawater. And so drinking seawater actually makes you more dehydrated because you lose more water than you gained through peeing out the salt. That's why they tell you to never drink seawater. These guys don't have any choice. There's nothing else for them to drink. So they drink seawater, and they actually have, much like the fish do, they have a gland in their nasal passages that actively transports salt out of the nasal passages and into the nasal cavity. And that's what this little tube nose is on the top of this guy's beak here. The salt glands are contained in that tube, and then they can basically snot rocket out a bunch of salt. So they can eliminate the salt from their body that way. So that's how they're able to cope with drinking seawater. So that's one example. Kangaroo rats are also really cool. They're a desert-specific species. We actually have them here in the prairie in Colorado. And in the prairie in the summer, there's almost no water. So these guys don't have a source of liquid water that they can drink. So they get all the water that they need from their food. And their food is largely seeds. And you may be thinking, okay, there's not a lot of water in a seed. Totally true. There's not a lot of water in a seed. But what the kangaroo rat can do is that when it breaks down those seeds, breaks down the compounds in those seeds, one of the byproducts is water. And so they are able to get all the water that they need for their metabolism simply from breaking down those seeds, which is pretty amazing. They also conserve water by recollecting water from their exhaled breath in their nasal cavities. So they've got a bunch of really cool adaptations that allow them to survive in the desert. All right, so that's our little lecture on water conformity. I'm going to have another one on different types of excretory systems, so check that out next.